The Houston Texans have been one of the most talked about teams this offseason, and for good reason. Not only has Houston been one of the busiest teams this offseason, but the Texans have also pulled off multiple trades, have a brand new head coach, and oh yeah, Houston has a young new quarterback likely on the way thanks to the second overall pick in this upcoming draft. The Texans were horrendous last season to say the least. Houston didn't even win a game at home, although they did tie once. It was a pretty odd year. It was the first year without Deshaun Watson on the roster. Lovie Smith was in his first season as the Texans head coach, and Houston ended up finishing 3-13-1 and nearly secured the first overall pick at the 2023 draft. But after the Texans managed to come back in dramatic fashion to beat the Colts in week 18, they dropped to the second overall pick. Now, that gave the Bears the first overall pick, which Chicago proceeded to trade to the Panthers. Carolina now gets their pick of the quarterbacks before the Texans get the next one, and it's very possible that the Texans actually get the guy that they want. It's really been between one of two guys, Bryce Young or CJ Stroud. It kind of feels like a given that they're going to go 1-2 at the draft, but the question now is who goes first? And the closer we get to the draft, it sounds like the Panthers are really in love with CJ Stroud. Mel Kiper also agrees and mocked Stroud to Carolina in his third mock draft, which leaves Alabama quarterback Bryce Young to the Texans. Even Vegas agrees that that's probably the most likely option, but Daniel Jeremiah had it flipped in his third mock. Instead, Young went 1, and Ohio State quarterback CJ Stroud dropped to Houston at 2. And to be completely honest with you guys, I don't think either team can really lose here. Of course, there's pros and cons to both guys, but if I was a front office, I wouldn't be upset with either guy. Either way, the Texans are really entering a new era, very likely with a new quarterback and also a new head coach, DeMeco Ryans. Houston really has been hiring and firing coaches like it's nothing as of late. After the disastrous debacle of Bill O'Brien after he was named general manager alongside head coach, the Texans have had a different head coach in every season. It was David Culley in 2021, who was then fired for Lovie Smith ahead of 2022. Lovie was then fired after this past season, and now it's up to DeMeco Ryans, who was last the 49ers defensive coordinator. But he's a fan favorite in Houston, and for good reason. He played linebacker for the Texans from 2006 to 2011 after being a second-round pick. Ryans now has his hands full in rebuilding the team he once played for, which is not an easy task. But Houston has definitely made some strides. The Texans have been pretty active this offseason, even in trades. The biggest one was sending away Brandon Cooks to the Cowboys for 5th and 6th round picks. Houston did try to combat that by signing Robert Woods to a 2-year, $15.25 million deal, but Woods is coming off of a very down year. He only had 527 yards despite playing in every game last season, but to be honest, I think you can probably chalk a lot of that up to the Titans' disastrous passing game. He is now 30 and hasn't really looked the same since tearing his ACL in 2021, but we'll see if he can bounce back in Houston. The other big signing for the Texans passing game was Dalton Schultz, who spent his last 5 seasons in Dallas. He had a career year in 2021 with 800 yards and 8 touchdowns. Schultz ultimately signed a 1-year, $9 million deal to stay in the state, but he wasn't even the only Cowboy heading to Houston. Wide receiver Noah Brown signed a 1-year, $3.1 million deal, and he just had a career season with 500 yards and 3 touchdowns. The Texans did bolster up their running back room, which does already have Dameon Pierce. Houston inked Devin Singletary to a 1-year, $3.75 million deal. He just wrapped up his rookie deal in Buffalo and is coming off of back-to-back 800-yard seasons. Mike Boone also signed a 1-year deal with $3.1 million, and I gotta imagine he's probably going to be the third-string running back. But outside of that, one of the biggest things that the Texans did improve this offseason was the offensive line. A very underrated move Houston pulled off was trading for Shaq Mason from the Buccaneers. As a Patriots fan, I know him well, he's a good guard, and Houston was able to get him for just a 6th-round pick. It may seem like a low price, but Mason is on his last year of his deal, and Tampa Bay is obviously in a rebuild now. The Texans did also lock up left tackle Laramie Tunsil to a 3-year, $75 million extension. He's going to be a massive piece for any young quarterback that the Texans decide to bring in. If Houston can have a good blocking unit, there are a lot of reasons to feel comfortable. The Texans did also sign tight end Andrew Beck for $6 million over 2 years. He's really just a blocking tight tight end, so he'll help out there too. Finally, the Texans did sign another quarterback as well, likely to just help develop a young quarterback, and that's Case Keenum. Case Keenum is a perfect backup, and he's locked up in Houston for the next 2 years at $6.2 million. On the defense, D'Amico Ryans is coming in, and hopefully he's gonna completely turn around that pretty bad unit. One of the most interesting offseason signings for Houston was actually Jimmy Ward. He got $13 million for 2 seasons. Ward spent 6 years together with Ryans, so there's a lot of familiarity there, and he could really be moved all around as a defensive back. So that's a huge benefit too. He's not the only former 49er to come to Houston either though. Hassan Ridgeway also signed with the Texans. He signed just a 1-year, $4 million contract, so it's kind of a band-aid solution, but the run defense was one of the biggest problems last season for the Texans, so it was a pretty clear point of emphasis. Houston also signed Sheldon Rankins to a 1-year, $9.7 million deal, and he's a true vet, and he has 23.5 sacks in his 7-year career. Lastly, Houston signed another expatriate, Chase Winovich, which is a pretty interesting move. I mean, it's just $2 million for a season, so it's pretty low risk, but I think the reward could be high. Winovich has been a very back and forth player and had spurts of being really good and also spurts of being non-existent, but the Texans surely seem to think he has some good play left in him. Houston didn't have a ton of talent on their roster last season. The offense really ran through Dameon Pierce, who was a rookie 4th-round pick. He ended up putting together a 900+ yard season, which is super promising. It will be interesting to see John Mechie play if he does in fact return. He was taken in the 2nd round last year by the Texans, but ultimately didn't play after he was diagnosed with leukemia. But he has been making good steady progress and may be back. He was just so good at Alabama and could really be a big boost for the Texans. It will be interesting to see what happens with Davis Mills. I mean, he's been solid for what he is, a 3rd-round pick who was given no weapons. Through his first 2 years in Houston, he had 5,782 yards and 33 touchdowns to 25 interceptions. I mean, he was okay, but the Texans needed something, or really anything at that point, and he came in at the perfect time. But it's obviously time to move on to get a better quarterback. On the other side of the ball, the Texans defense has a lot of love in the secondary for the future. Derek Stingley is the very big name. He was a 3rd overall pick in 2022, but did only play in 9 games as a rookie. The next round, Houston selected Jalen Petrie, who ended up playing well and was even named to the PFWA All-Rookie team. Now, there aren't many positives past that though. Jerry Hughes is at least worth pointing out after he had a huge 9-sack season out of nowhere last season, but there are some okay pieces in Houston, but there is no doubt that they are in a rebuild. The Texans are actually in a pretty good spot, at least for a rebuild that is. You have the 2nd overall pick in a class with some good quarterback names, and honestly, it's hard to be upset whether Houston gets CJ Stroud or Bryce Young. There's some good weapons on offense. I mean, they aren't great, but the offensive line is good enough. Frankly, things could be a lot worse. I do think the defense is still gonna be pretty bad, but it should be better than last season at the very least, and with some good developmental pieces in the secondary, if these guys can progress and the Texans continue to build well, Houston could be on the upswing, and D'Amico Ryans is going to be that guy leading the way.